The rain fell over New York like a funeral shroud, cold and relentless, washing the sins of the city into gutters that had witnessed more blood than the confessionals of 1,000 churches. In the heart of Brooklyn, where the old Italian families still held their silent dominion over streets that bore no names on any honest map, there stood a mansion that the neighborhood simply called the Salvetti house. Its iron gates were always closed, its windows always watching, and its shadows always hungry for secrets. Dante Marrone stood at those gates on the night everything ended, though he did not know it yet. He was 31 years old, built like a man who had learned to fight before he learned to read, with hands that had broken bones and eyes that had seen too much death to ever soften again. His black coat was soaked through, clinging to shoulders that had carried the weight of loyalty for 15 years without complaint. The rain traced the scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone, a memento from a knife fight in his 19th year, when he had thrown himself between Vittoria Salvetti and a man who wanted her dead. He had killed that man with his bare hands, while the blood from his own face painted the floor crimson. That was who Dante Marrone was, the shield, the shadow, the soldier who never questioned, never hesitated, and never asked for anything in return except the privilege of belonging to something greater than himself. He had been 12 years old when Don Enzo Salvetti found him sleeping in a cardboard box behind a restaurant in Little Italy. His mother had died of pneumonia 3 months before, and his father had never existed except as a name his mother refused to speak. The Don had looked down at the starving boy with eyes that calculated everything and revealed nothing, and then he had extended his hand. "Come with me," he had said. "I will give you a family, I will give you a purpose, and in return, you will give me your loyalty until the day you die." Dante had taken that hand without hesitation. He had not known then what loyalty truly meant, what it would cost him, what it would demand of his soul. He had only known that he was cold and hungry and alone, and that this man with silver in his hair and iron in his voice was offering him something no one had ever offered him before: a home. The Salvetti mansion became his universe. Don Enzo raised him alongside his 4 daughters, though always with the unspoken understanding that Dante was not truly one of them. He was something else, something useful. He ate at their table, but never at the head. He slept under their roof, but in the servants' quarters. He protected them with his life, but was never permitted to forget that his life was worth less than theirs. This was the way of the world he had chosen, and Dante accepted it with the quiet resignation of a man who had never expected kindness from the universe. The 4 Salvetti sisters became the center of his existence, though each held a different piece of his fractured heart. Vittoria was the eldest, 33 years old on the night of the betrayal, with the sharp beauty of a woman who had learned to wield her intelligence like a stiletto. Her hair was black as a widow's veil, always pinned up in elegant arrangements that made her look like a queen surveying her kingdom. She had inherited her father's calculating mind and his ruthless pragmatism, and everyone in the organization knew that she would one day sit in his chair. Dante had loved her first, with the desperate devotion of a boy who did not understand the difference between gratitude and romance. She had never looked at him as anything more than a loyal dog, useful and dependable, but she had also never been cruel. When he saved her life at 19, she had touched his bleeding face and said, "You are a good soldier, Dante. My father was right to keep you." Those words had sustained him for years, even as he learned to bury his feelings so deep that he almost forgot they existed. Serena was 29, the second daughter, and she was everything Vittoria was not. Where Vittoria was ice, Serena was fire. She had red hair that cascaded down her back like flames, and a body she used as deliberately as any weapon in the family's arsenal. Men fell at her feet, and she stepped over them without looking back. She was ambitious in a way that frightened even Don Enzo sometimes, always pushing for more power, more influence, more control. Dante had watched her seduce and destroy 6 rivals over the years, and he had learned to keep his distance. But even distance could not protect him from the way she sometimes looked at him, as if she was measuring his worth and finding him just barely acceptable. She called him little brother when she was in a good mood, and nothing at all when she was not. Lucia was 26, the 3rd daughter, and she was the one Dante understood least. She rarely spoke, rarely smiled, rarely showed any emotion at all. Her eyes were dark pools that reflected nothing, and she moved through the mansion like a ghost, always watching, always listening, always knowing more than she revealed. The soldiers whispered that she was touched by something otherworldly, that she could see deaths before they happened, that she had once predicted the betrayal of a capo 3 days before he turned informant. Dante did not believe in such things, but he could not deny that Lucia unsettled him. She had never thanked him for anything, never acknowledged his existence except in the most perfunctory ways, and yet sometimes he caught her staring at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He did not know if she hated him or pitied him or felt nothing at all. And then there was Bianca. Bianca was 22, the youngest, and she was the only one who had ever made Dante feel like he might actually belong. She had her mother's soft features and gentle nature, a throwback to the woman Don Enzo had loved and lost to cancer when Bianca was only 5. Unlike her sisters, Bianca seemed to genuinely care about the people around her, even the soldiers and servants who meant nothing in the grand hierarchy of the organization. She brought Dante coffee when he stood guard at night. She asked about his health when he returned from dangerous assignments. She laughed at his rare jokes and remembered his birthday when no one else did. For years, Dante had told himself that her kindness meant nothing special, that she was simply a good person in a world that did not deserve her. But in his most secret heart, in the place where he kept the dreams he would never speak aloud, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she saw him as something more than a useful shadow. These were the 4 women he would have died for without hesitation. These were the 4 women who chose to let him die. The night began like any other. Don Enzo had summoned Dante to his study, a room filled with old books and older secrets, where the portraits of dead patriarchs stared down from the walls with disapproving eyes. The Don was 71 years old, his hair entirely silver now, his face lined with the weight of decades spent balancing power and survival. He sat behind his mahogany desk like a king on his throne, and Dante stood before him like the loyal knight he had always been. "There is a meeting tonight," Don Enzo said, his voice as cold and measured as always. "Marco Vellini will be there. You will accompany my daughters and ensure his safety." Dante felt a flicker of something dark in his chest, though he kept his face expressionless. Marco Vellini was the son of Alessandro Vellini, one of the most powerful allies of the Salvetti family. The Vellinis controlled the unions and the shipping lanes, and their partnership with the Salvettis had kept both families prosperous for a generation. Marco was being groomed to inherit his father's empire, which made him valuable. It also made him insufferable. He was 28 years old, handsome in the polished way of men who had never known hardship, with perfect teeth and manicured hands, and a smile that never reached his eyes. He treated everyone beneath his station with barely concealed contempt, and he treated Dante with outright disdain. More than once, Dante had heard Marco refer to him as the Salvetti pet, the orphan dog they kept around for tricks. Dante had swallowed these insults as he swallowed everything else, because that was what loyalty demanded. But he had never forgotten them. "The meeting is at the Ferrante warehouse," Don Enzo continued. "It is supposed to be a negotiation, but I do not trust Giovanni Ferrante. He has been too quiet lately, too cooperative. Take extra precautions." Dante nodded. He understood what the Don was not saying. The Ferrantes were the old enemy, the rival family that had been locked in a cold war with the Salvettis for decades. Giovanni Ferrante was a snake in an expensive suit, all smiles and handshakes, while his men sharpened their knives in the shadows. If he was being cooperative, it meant he was planning something. The drive to the warehouse took them through the darkest parts of Brooklyn, past abandoned factories and empty lots where bodies had been buried and forgotten. Dante sat in the front passenger seat of the black sedan, his hand resting on the gun beneath his jacket, his eyes scanning every shadow for threats. Behind him, the 4 Salvetti sisters sat in tense silence, their expensive dresses and jewels incongruous against the grim landscape outside the windows. Marco Vellini sat between Serena and Bianca, his arm draped casually over the back of the seat, as if he owned everything his eyes touched. Dante could feel Marco's gaze on the back of his neck, amused and contemptuous. "Relax, pet," Marco said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Nothing is going to happen. The Ferrantes know better than to start a war they cannot win." Dante did not respond. He had learned long ago that arguing with men like Marco was pointless. They heard only what they wanted to hear, and they believed only in their own invincibility. It was a belief that got men killed in this world, but Marco had never faced real danger in his pampered life. He did not understand that death did not care about family names or business alliances or the size of one's bank account. The warehouse loomed ahead, a massive structure of rusted metal and broken windows that had once housed a textile factory before the neighborhood collapsed into decay. 2 Ferrante soldiers stood at the entrance, their faces hard and watchful, their hands conspicuously close to their weapons. Dante did not like any of it. The location was too isolated, too easy to surround, too perfect for an ambush. But the Don had given his orders, and Dante was not paid to question. He was paid to protect. The meeting itself was brief and unremarkable. Giovanni Ferrante, a heavy man with a silver tongue and dead eyes, proposed a new arrangement for territory distribution that everyone knew would never be honored. Vittoria negotiated on behalf of her father with cold precision, conceding nothing of value while appearing to compromise. Marco sat beside her like a trophy, contributing nothing except his presence and his father's name. Dante stood against the wall with the other soldiers, watching the shadows, counting the exits, calculating escape routes in case everything went wrong. Everything went wrong. It happened so fast that Dante barely had time to react. One moment the meeting was concluding with hollow handshakes and empty promises, and the next moment the lights went out and the warehouse exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted from every direction, muzzle flashes strobing in the darkness like lightning in a storm. Dante threw himself toward the Salvetti sisters, his gun already in his hand, his body moving on instinct, honed by 15 years of violence. "Get down!" he shouted, pushing Bianca behind an overturned table as bullets tore through the air around them. He could see Ferrante soldiers swarming through the side doors, more than anyone had expected, more than the Salvettis had brought to counter. This was not a negotiation that had gone wrong. This was an execution that had been planned from the beginning. Dante killed 3 men in the first 30 seconds, his shots precise and lethal, his movements fluid despite the terror that clawed at his chest. He had always been good at violence. It was the only thing he had ever truly excelled at, the only skill that made him valuable to the people he loved. He used that skill now with desperate fury, clearing a path toward the back exit, grabbing Lucia's arm and pulling her along, while Vittoria and Serena followed close behind. But Marco Vellini was not with them. Dante looked back and saw him cowering behind a pillar, his face white with fear, his expensive suit splattered with blood that might have been his own or might have belonged to one of the dead men on the floor. 3 Ferrante soldiers were advancing toward him, their intentions clear. They wanted him alive. A hostage from the Vellini family would be worth more than 1,000 dead Salvettis. Dante made his decision without thinking. He pushed Lucia toward Vittoria, pressed his backup gun into Bianca's trembling hands, and ran back into the hell he had just escaped. He reached Marco just as the first soldier grabbed for him, and he put a bullet through the man's skull before pivoting to engage the other 2. The fight was brutal and desperate, fists and elbows and the wet crunch of breaking bones. By the time it was over, Dante had a knife wound in his side and a bullet graze along his ribs, but all 3 soldiers were dead and Marco was still breathing. This way, Dante gasped, grabbing Marco's arm and dragging him toward the back exit. "We need to move." But there was no exit anymore. The Ferrantes had anticipated their escape route and sealed it with a wall of armed men. Dante counted at least a dozen, all with guns raised, all with the cold eyes of professionals who had come to do a job. He turned to find another way out, but there was nothing. They were trapped in a narrow corridor between the main warehouse and the loading dock, with enemies on both sides and no cover except shadows. And then the 4 Salvetti sisters appeared at the far end of the corridor, backlit by the dim glow of emergency lighting, their faces pale and stricken with fear. Dante felt a surge of hope. They had found another way out. They had come back for him. For just a moment, he believed that everything might still be all right. Vittoria's voice cut through the chaos, cold and clear. "We can only take one." Dante did not understand at first. He thought she was talking about something else, some tactical decision about how to proceed. But then he saw the way the 4 sisters were looking at him, and at Marco, and at the men who were closing in from both sides. And he understood. The Ferrantes wanted Marco Vellini. They did not particularly care about Dante Marrone. If the sisters took Marco and left Dante behind, the Ferrantes might let them go. It was a gamble, but it was a gamble that made cold, practical sense. Marco was valuable. Dante was not. "Vittoria," Dante said, and he hated the pleading note that crept into his voice. "Vittoria, please." He saw her hesitate. He saw something flicker in her dark eyes, something that might have been regret or might have been relief at having the decision made for her. Then she turned away, and Serena stepped forward to take Marco's arm. "Come on," Serena said to Marco, her voice brisk and businesslike. "We need to move now." Marco did not hesitate. He did not look back at the man who had just saved his life at the cost of his own. He simply followed Serena toward the exit that the sisters had found, his survival instinct overriding whatever shred of honor he might have possessed. Dante looked at Lucia, but her face was as blank as always, her dark eyes revealing nothing. She turned and followed her sisters without a word, without a glance, without a moment of hesitation. And then there was only Bianca. She stood at the end of the corridor, her soft features twisted with anguish, tears streaming down her cheeks. For one desperate moment, Dante thought she might refuse. He thought she might run to him, take his hand, stay by his side, even if it meant dying together. That was what family did. That was what love meant. And he had believed foolishly and desperately that Bianca loved him. "Bianca," he said, and his voice broke on her name. She opened her mouth as if to speak. And then Vittoria's hand closed around her wrist, and Vittoria pulled her away, and Bianca let herself be pulled. She did not fight. She did not scream. She simply let her tears fall as she walked away from the man who had given her 15 years of devotion, leaving him alone in that corridor with the enemies closing in. The last thing Dante saw before the darkness took him was Bianca's face disappearing around the corner, her eyes meeting his for one final moment, full of sorrow and guilt, and the terrible knowledge that she had chosen her sisters over him. Then the Ferrante soldiers reached him and the beating began. They took their time. They had no reason to hurry, and they seemed to enjoy their work. Fists and boots and the handles of guns rained down on Dante's body until he could no longer tell where one pain ended and another began. They broke his ribs and his nose and 3 of his fingers. They opened cuts across his face and arms and chest that would leave scars for the rest of his life. They asked him questions about the Salvetti organization, and when he refused to answer, they hurt him worse. But through all of it, Dante did not make a sound. He would not give them the satisfaction of hearing him scream, and he would not give the Salvetti sisters the excuse of believing he had died quickly, mercifully, without suffering. If he was going to die in this place, he would die with the same silent loyalty that had defined his entire existence. It was all he had left. The beating stopped eventually. Not because the Ferrante soldiers had grown tired of it, but because someone called them away. Dante lay on the cold concrete floor, his blood pooling around him, his vision fading in and out like a dying candle. He heard voices in the distance, arguing about something. He heard footsteps receding, doors slamming, cars driving away. And then there was only silence, and the rain that had begun to fall through the broken skylights, washing over his ruined body like a final baptism. He should have died there. By every law of medicine and probability, Dante Marrone should have bled out on that warehouse floor and been forgotten by everyone who had ever known him. The Salvetti sisters would have mourned him briefly if they mourned him at all, and then they would have moved on with their lives. Marco Vellini would have married one of them, probably Vittoria, and the alliance between the families would have grown stronger. Don Enzo would have found another loyal soldier to replace the one he had lost, and Dante's memory would have faded into the fog of history like so many other nameless men who had died in service to families that did not deserve their devotion. But death, it seemed, was not ready for Dante Marrone. He was found 3 hours later by a man he had never expected to see again. Salvatore Cortesi was 64 years old, a former underboss of the Salvetti organization who had been excommunicated 20 years before for reasons that no one outside the inner circle understood. The official story was that he had betrayed Don Enzo, but Dante had always suspected the truth was more complicated. Salvatore had been the Don's closest friend once, his brother in all but blood, and the rift between them had left scars that neither man ever spoke about. Now Salvatore ran a small criminal empire of his own, modest compared to the Salvettis, but fiercely independent. He had no love for Don Enzo and no reason to care about the broken soldier bleeding out in a Ferrante warehouse, but he cared anyway. Perhaps because he saw something of himself in Dante's shattered body. Perhaps because he understood what it meant to be abandoned by people you would have died for. Or perhaps because he was simply a better man than the world had allowed him to be. Salvatore's men carried Dante to a safe house and called in doctors who asked no questions. For 2 weeks Dante hovered between life and death, his body fighting to survive, even as his mind retreated into the darkness of fever and delirium. He dreamed of the Salvetti sisters, their faces twisted into masks of indifference as they walked away. He dreamed of Bianca's tears, falling like rain on the cold concrete of his grave. He dreamed of the boy he had been, the one who had taken Don Enzo's hand and believed that loyalty would be rewarded with love. When he finally woke, that boy was dead. The man who opened his eyes in that safe house was someone new, someone harder, someone who understood at last that loyalty was a lie that the powerful told the weak to keep them obedient. The Salvetti sisters had not loved him. They had used him, as they used everyone, and when his usefulness ran out, they had discarded him without a second thought. Dante Marrone had died in that warehouse, abandoned and alone, but something else had been born from his ashes, something cold and patient and utterly without mercy. And one day that something would return to collect what was owed. Salvatore sat by his bedside on the morning Dante finally regained full consciousness. The old man's face was weathered by decades of violence and regret, but his eyes were kind in a way that Dante had not seen in a long time. "You should be dead," Salvatore said simply. "The doctors say it is a miracle you survived." Dante stared at the ceiling, his jaw clenched against the pain that radiated through every inch of his body. "Why did you save me?" he asked. "You have no reason to care whether I live or die." Salvatore was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Because I know what it is to be betrayed by people you loved. And because I see in you something that should not be wasted. You have fire in you, Dante. Fire that the Salvettis never deserved." "They left me to die," Dante said, and his voice was flat, empty of the rage that should have been there. "The sisters. I would have given my life for any of them, and they left me to die for Marco Vellini." "I know," Salvatore said. "I know everything. My people have been watching the Salvettis for years. I saw what happened at that warehouse. I saw them make their choice." Dante turned his head to look at the old man. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "No one saves a stranger out of kindness." "Not in this world." Salvatore smiled, but it was a sad smile, full of old grief and older wisdom. "I want nothing from you," he said. "I am giving you a choice. You can walk away from this life entirely. I will give you money, a new identity, passage to somewhere far from here. You can disappear and never look back, or you can stay. You can learn what I have to teach you. You can build something of your own, something that belongs to no one but you. And when you are ready, you can decide for yourself what to do about the people who threw you away." Dante closed his eyes. He thought of Bianca's face, streaked with tears but still walking away. He thought of Vittoria's cold calculation, choosing the valuable asset over the loyal soldier. He thought of Serena and Lucia, following without question, without protest, without a single word of objection. He thought of 15 years of devotion, reduced to nothing in a single moment of pragmatic betrayal, and he made his choice. "I will stay," he said. "Teach me everything." Salvatore nodded as if he had expected nothing else. "Then we begin tomorrow," he said. "Rest now. You have a long road ahead of you." Dante did not rest. He lay awake in the darkness of that safe house, listening to the rain fall outside the windows, and he felt the last traces of the man he used to be drain away like blood from an open wound. In their place, something new was taking shape, something that would not love, would not trust, would not believe in the goodness of anyone ever again. The Salvetti sisters had made their choice, and one day they would understand the true cost of what they had done. But that day was still far away. For now, Dante had work to do. 3 years passed like shadows moving across a graveyard, slow and silent and full of secrets. In that time, Dante Marrone ceased to exist. The loyal soldier who had given everything to the Salvetti family was buried in an unmarked grave that no one ever visited, mourned by no one, remembered by no one, forgotten by everyone who had once claimed to care about him. In his place, something else emerged from the darkness, something forged in pain and tempered by betrayal, something that walked through the underworld of New York like a ghost that had learned to bite. Salvatore Cortese kept his promise. He taught Dante everything he knew, and what Salvatore knew could fill libraries that respectable men would burn rather than read. The old man had spent 40 years in the shadows of organized crime, learning every trick, every scheme, every method of acquiring power, without attracting the attention of those who already held it. He had survived betrayals that should have killed him, navigated wars that had consumed entire families, and built a small empire from nothing but cunning and patience. Now he passed that knowledge to his unlikely protégé, watching with quiet satisfaction as Dante absorbed every lesson like a man dying of thirst. The first year was the hardest. Dante's body healed slowly, the broken bones knitting back together with agonizing deliberation, the scars forming across his skin like a map of everything he had lost. There were days when he could barely walk, when the pain was so overwhelming that he wanted nothing more than to close his eyes and let the darkness take him. But every time that temptation arose, he thought of Bianca's face disappearing around that corner, and the rage that surged through him was stronger than any pain. He would not die. He would not give them the satisfaction of believing their choice had been the right one. He would survive, and he would become something that made them regret every tear they had failed to shed. Salvatore understood this rage, but he also understood that rage alone was not enough. Rage made men stupid. Rage made them reckless. Rage got them killed before they could accomplish anything worth dying for. So he taught Dante to channel his fury into something colder, something more controlled, something that could wait years for the perfect moment and then strike without mercy or hesitation. "You are not a soldier anymore," Salvatore told him one evening as they sat in the back room of a restaurant that served as his unofficial headquarters. "Soldiers follow orders. Soldiers die for other men's causes. You must become something else, a strategist, a builder, a man who gives orders instead of taking them. Only then will you have the power to do what must be done." Dante listened, and he learned. He studied the operations of every major crime family in the city, mapping their territories, their alliances, their weaknesses. He learned to read financial statements and launder money through legitimate businesses. He learned to identify which politicians could be bought and which ones were too dangerous to approach. He learned to speak softly and carry invisible weapons, to smile at men he despised and shake hands with men he would eventually destroy. He became fluent in the language of power, a language he had never been permitted to learn while he was busy being the Salvetti family's loyal dog. The second year brought opportunities. Salvatore introduced him to contacts in other cities, men who operated outside the traditional structure of the New York families and who were always looking for capable partners. Dante proved his worth in a dozen small operations, handling problems that required both intelligence and violence, building a reputation as a man who could be trusted to get things done without asking too many questions. The money started flowing, slowly at first, then faster as word spread that there was a new player in the shadows, someone with no allegiance to any of the established powers, someone who could be hired for delicate work that the old families preferred not to handle themselves. By the end of the second year, Dante had accumulated enough capital to begin building something of his own. He acquired a small shipping company as his first legitimate front, using it to move goods that customs officials were paid not to notice. He recruited men who had been discarded by other organizations, soldiers and enforcers who had been deemed too difficult or too damaged to be useful, and he gave them something they had never had before: respect. He paid them fairly, listened to their concerns, and never asked them to take risks that he was not willing to take himself. In return, they gave him a loyalty that was more genuine than anything he had ever experienced in the Salvetti household. A loyalty born of mutual respect, rather than obligation or fear. Salvatore watched all of this, with the quiet pride of a father watching his son exceed every expectation. "You have learned well," he said one night, as they shared a bottle of wine in his study. "You have become everything I hoped you would become, and more. But I must ask you something, Dante. Something important." Dante set down his glass and met the old man's eyes. "Ask," he said. "What do you intend to do about the Salvettis?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Dante had never spoken directly about his plans for the family that had abandoned him. He had buried that topic so deep that even Salvatore had learned not to raise it. But now, as he sat in the warmth of this room that had become more of a home to him than the Salvetti mansion had ever been, he found that the words came easier than he had expected. "Nothing," he said. Salvatore raised an eyebrow. "Nothing." "I am not going to destroy them," Dante clarified. "I am not going to wage war against them or expose their secrets or put bullets in their heads. That is what they would expect. That is what they have probably been preparing for if they even remember that I exist. They think I am dead, and even if they suspect otherwise, they assume I am coming for revenge. But I am not going to give them revenge. I am going to give them something far worse. And what is that?" Dante smiled, but there was no warmth in it, no humor, no humanity. "I am going to let them live with what they did," he said. "I am going to become successful and powerful and completely indifferent to their existence. I am going to walk back into their world as if nothing happened, and when they try to reach out to me, when they try to apologize or explain or reconnect, I am going to treat them like strangers. I am going to show them that their betrayal meant nothing to me, that they meant nothing to me, and that will hurt them more than any bullet ever could." Salvatore was silent for a long moment, studying Dante's face with an expression that was difficult to read. Then he nodded slowly. "You have changed," he said. "The boy I found bleeding in that warehouse would have wanted blood. He would have dreamed of revenge every night and plotted their deaths every day. But you are not that boy anymore." "No," Dante agreed. "I am not." The third year was when everything came together. Dante's organization had grown from a handful of discarded soldiers to a network that spanned 3 states, with operations in shipping, construction, waste management, and a dozen other industries that the legitimate world preferred not to examine too closely. He had money, power, influence, and the respect of men who had once served families far more established than his. He was no longer Dante Marrone, the orphan soldier. He was something else entirely, a name whispered in the shadows, a force that the old families were beginning to notice and worry about. The Salvetti family had noticed too, though they did not yet understand who they were dealing with. Don Enzo's intelligence network had reported on the rise of a mysterious new player in the underworld, someone who operated with unusual discipline and seemed to have no connections to any of the established organizations. The Don had assigned Vittoria to investigate, trusting her sharp mind to uncover the identity and intentions of this potential threat or ally. But Vittoria's investigators had found nothing. Dante had learned his lessons well, and he had buried his true identity under so many layers of misdirection that even the Salvetti family's considerable resources could not penetrate the deception. Meanwhile, the 4 Salvetti sisters had continued their lives as if nothing had changed, as if they had not left a man to die in a warehouse 3 years before. But something had changed, something subtle that only those who knew them well might have noticed. There was a shadow over the Salvetti household now, a weight that pressed down on all of them in different ways. Vittoria had become even colder, even more calculating, throwing herself into the family business with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She had taken over more and more of her father's responsibilities as Don Enzo's health began to fail, and she ran the organization with an iron efficiency that left no room for sentiment or doubt. But sometimes, late at night, she sat alone in her study and stared at the wall, and the servants who passed by swore they could hear her whispering a name that no one in the household was permitted to speak. Serena had married Marco Vellini, just as everyone had expected. The wedding had been lavish and cold, a business transaction disguised as a celebration, and Serena had played her role with the practiced perfection of a woman who had learned to hide her true feelings behind a mask of beauty and ambition. But the marriage was not happy. Marco was everything Dante had always known him to be, arrogant and shallow, and utterly unworthy of the woman he had won through someone else's sacrifice. Serena endured his presence with barely concealed contempt, and there were rumors that she had taken lovers, though no one dared to confirm them. Whatever fire had once burned in her seemed to have dimmed, replaced by a bitter resignation that aged her more than the years themselves. Lucia remained as enigmatic as ever, the silent watcher who saw everything and said nothing. But those who paid attention noticed that she had begun to withdraw even further from the world, spending long hours alone in the chapel at the back of the estate, lighting candles for purposes she never explained. The servants whispered that she was praying for someone, though they could not imagine who. Lucia had never shown attachment to anyone, had never seemed to care about anything beyond her own mysterious thoughts. But something had changed in her since that night at the warehouse, something that even her expressionless face could not entirely conceal. And Bianca, the youngest, the kindest, the one who had wept as she walked away from the man who loved her, had changed most of all. The gentle girl who had once brought coffee to the soldiers and remembered everyone's birthday had retreated into herself, becoming quiet and withdrawn and desperately sad. She rarely smiled anymore. She rarely spoke to anyone except when necessity demanded it. She had refused 3 marriage proposals in the past 2 years, offering no explanation beyond a simple refusal to discuss the matter. The household believed she was mourning someone, though they assumed it must be some secret lover who had died or disappeared. None of them suspected that she was mourning the soldier she had abandoned, the man whose face haunted her dreams with accusations she could never answer. Don Enzo watched his daughters with the weary eyes of a father who understood more than he revealed. He knew what they had done that night. He had been told every detail, had listened without expression as Vittoria explained the pragmatic necessity of their choice, had nodded his approval even as something deep in his ancient heart had broken. Marco Vellini was valuable. Dante Marrone was not. That was the calculus of power, the arithmetic of survival. And Don Enzo had spent his entire life making exactly these kinds of decisions. But this one felt different. This one left a stain on his soul that all the confessions in the world could not wash away. He did not know that Dante was still alive. He did not know that the mysterious new player his intelligence network had reported was the very soldier he had raised from childhood and then discarded like a broken tool. But he suspected. In the quiet moments between meetings and decisions, when the weight of his years pressed down on him and he allowed himself to remember the past, Don Enzo thought about the boy who had taken his hand in that alley so many years ago. He thought about the look of absolute trust in those young eyes, the desperate gratitude of a child who had finally found something to believe in. And he wondered if that trust had been betrayed, if that belief had been shattered, if the boy had died cursing the family that had failed him. These were thoughts he kept to himself. These were questions he would never ask aloud, but they weighed on him nonetheless, adding to the burden of a life spent accumulating power at the cost of everything that made power worth having. The day Dante returned to New York was a grey morning in late autumn, the kind of morning when the city seemed to exist in a state of suspended grief, waiting for something that might never come. He arrived not as a conquering hero or a vengeful ghost, but as a businessman, a legitimate entrepreneur with meetings scheduled and appointments to keep. His car was expensive but not ostentatious, his suit was perfectly tailored but not flashy, and his face was the face of a stranger that no one in the Salvetti organization would recognize. The scars had healed, though they had left their marks. The scar from the knife fight at 19 was still visible, a thin white line running from eyebrow to cheekbone, but it had been joined by others, a crescent moon on his jaw from a ring that had split his skin during the warehouse beating, a ragged line along his neck from a knife that had come within millimeters of his carotid artery, countless smaller marks hidden beneath his clothing, like a secret history written on his flesh. His body had changed too, leaner and harder than before, with the controlled power of a man who had learned that strength was nothing without discipline. His eyes were the greatest change of all. They had once been the eyes of a loyal dog, eager to please and desperate for approval. Now they were the eyes of a wolf, patient and cold and utterly without illusion. He did not go to the Salvetti mansion. He did not seek out the sisters who had betrayed him or the Don who had raised him. Instead, he began building his presence in the city with the same methodical patience he had learned from Salvatore. He acquired properties, established businesses, made connections with people who mattered. He attended charity galas and business conferences, shaking hands and making small talk with the kind of people who moved through the legitimate world without ever acknowledging the shadows that made their wealth possible. He became known as Daniel Morrow, a self-made entrepreneur with vague origins and impressive resources, a man who had appeared from nowhere and seemed destined to go everywhere. The name was Salvatore's suggestion, close enough to his real name that he would respond to it naturally, different enough that casual inquiries would lead nowhere. Daniel Morrow had a carefully constructed history, a paper trail of education and employment that would satisfy anyone who did not dig too deeply. He had attended a small private college in Massachusetts, worked for a series of investment firms in Boston, and decided to relocate to New York to pursue new opportunities. It was a plausible story, boring enough to discourage further questions, and Dante wore it like a second skin. 6 months after his return, he crossed paths with the Salvetti family for the first time. It happened at a fundraising dinner for a children's hospital, the kind of event where the wealthy gathered to congratulate themselves on their generosity while their real business was conducted in whispered conversations and meaningful glances. Dante had not planned to attend, but Salvatore had insisted. "You cannot avoid them forever," the old man had said, "and you should not want to. The power of your indifference depends on them seeing it firsthand. They need to know that you have moved on, that you have succeeded without them, that their betrayal cost you nothing. Only then will they understand what they truly lost." So Dante had come, dressed in a tuxedo that cost more than his entire wardrobe during his years as a Salvetti soldier, moving through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man who belonged wherever he chose to be. He made conversation with businessmen and politicians, accepted compliments on his recent acquisitions, deflected questions about his personal life with practiced charm. He was playing a role and he played it perfectly, never allowing the mask to slip even when he saw her across the room. Bianca Salvetti stood near the bar, wearing a blue dress that matched her eyes and the expression of profound unhappiness that no amount of makeup could conceal. She was thinner than he remembered, with shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and endless regret. She held a glass of champagne that she was not drinking, staring into its bubbles as if searching for answers that would never come. She looked, Dante thought with cold satisfaction, like a woman who was being slowly destroyed by guilt. He did not approach her. He did not need to. The room was large, but it was not infinite, and eventually their paths would cross. He simply waited, continuing his conversations, continuing his performance, continuing to be Daniel Morrow, while Dante Marrone watched from behind his eyes. It was Vittoria who noticed him first. She was standing with a group of men in expensive suits, discussing something that required serious expressions and occasional nods of agreement, when her gaze swept across the room and landed on his face. He saw her freeze, saw the color drain from her cheeks, saw her mouth open slightly, as if to speak a name she had not spoken in 3 years. For one long moment, their eyes met across the crowded room, and Dante allowed himself a small smile that contained nothing but ice. Then he turned away, as if she were no one of consequence, and resumed his conversation with the mayor's aide about property development in Brooklyn. He felt her approaching before he heard her. The crowd seemed to part for her as it always had, the natural deference that power commanded even in settings where everyone present had power of their own. When she reached him, she simply stood there for a moment, staring at him as if he were a ghost that had materialized from her darkest nightmares. The mayor's aide excused himself, sensing the tension without understanding its source. And then Dante and Vittoria were alone in the middle of a crowded room, surrounded by people who had no idea that they were witnessing a reunion that had been 3 years in the making. "Daniel Morrow," Dante said, extending his hand as if meeting a stranger. "A pleasure to meet you." Vittoria did not take his hand. She could not seem to move at all, her body frozen in place while her mind struggled to process what her eyes were telling her. "You are alive," she whispered, and her voice cracked on the words. "Dante, you are alive." "I am sorry," Dante replied, keeping his voice pleasant and confused, the voice of a man who had no idea what this woman was talking about. "Have we met?" "I do not recall." The pain that flashed across Vittoria's face was exquisite. She had been prepared for anger, for accusations, for the righteous fury of a man who had been betrayed. She had not been prepared for this, the absolute indifference of a stranger who did not recognize her, who did not remember her, who looked at her as if she were no more significant than any other face in the crowd. "Dante," she said again, more urgently this time. "It is me, Vittoria. You know me. You know who I am." Dante allowed a flicker of polite confusion to cross his features. "I am afraid you have mistaken me for someone else," he said. "My name is Daniel Morro. I do not know anyone named Dante." And with that he turned and walked away, leaving Vittoria standing alone in the middle of the room, her perfectly composed facade crumbling into something raw and desperate and completely exposed. He did not look back. The news spread through the Salvetti household like wildfire through dry grass, consuming everything in its path and leaving nothing but ashes and confusion behind. Vittoria had returned from the charity gala in a state that none of the servants had ever witnessed before, her composure shattered, her hands trembling, her eyes wild with something that looked disturbingly like fear. She had gone directly to her father's study and remained there for over an hour, and when she emerged, Don Enzo's face was the color of old parchment, aged and grey and haunted by ghosts that had suddenly become very real. "He is alive," Vittoria told her sisters that night, gathering them in the private sitting room where family matters were discussed away from the ears of servants and soldiers. "Dante is alive. I saw him. I spoke to him. He looked directly into my eyes and pretended not to know who I was." The reactions of the three younger sisters revealed more about what the past 3 years had done to them than any words could have expressed. Serena's face went through a rapid transformation, from shock to disbelief, to something that might have been relief before settling into a carefully neutral expression that fooled no one. She sat very still in her chair, her manicured fingers gripping the armrests with enough force to turn her knuckles white. Marco was in the next room, close enough to hear if voices were raised, and Serena was acutely aware of his presence even now, even in this moment, when her past had risen from the grave to confront her. "That is impossible," she said, her voice flat and controlled. "We all saw what happened. The Ferrantes would not have let him survive. They never let anyone survive." "And yet he did," Vittoria replied. "He calls himself Daniel Morro now. He has built an empire while we were busy pretending he never existed. Father's intelligence reports, the ones about the mysterious new player in the underworld, they were about him. Dante has become something we never imagined he could become. And he wants nothing to do with any of us." Lucia said nothing. She sat in the corner of the room, as she always did, her dark eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance that only she could see. But her stillness was different now, charged with an intensity that made the air around her feel heavy and oppressive. She had known. Somehow, in the way that Lucia always seemed to know things before they happened, she had known that Dante was not dead. She had lit candles for him in the chapel, not as prayers for his soul in heaven, but as prayers for his survival in the shadows of the world they all inhabited. It was Bianca who broke first, the youngest sister, who had spent 3 years drowning in guilt that she could never confess and grief that she could never explain, heard her sister's words and felt something inside her chest crack open, like a dam that had been holding back an ocean. She made a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a scream, something raw and wounded that seemed to come from the very core of her being. And then she was on her feet and running from the room before anyone could stop her. Vittoria did not try to follow. She understood, perhaps better than any of them, what Bianca was feeling. They had all made the same choice that night, but Bianca was the only one who had never been able to live with it. The others had found ways to justify their decision, to bury it beneath layers of pragmatism and necessity, to tell themselves that they had done what had to be done. Bianca had never managed that particular feat of self-deception. She had carried the weight of their collective sin alone, and now that weight had become something she could no longer bear. In the days that followed, the Salvetti sisters became obsessed with learning everything they could about Daniel Morro. Vittoria deployed her entire intelligence network, calling in favors, and spending money without regard for cost, determined to understand what Dante had become in the years since they had abandoned him. The information that came back painted a picture that was both impressive and terrifying. Daniel Morrow, also known as Dante Marrone, had built a criminal empire that rivaled some of the oldest families in the city. His organization controlled significant portions of the shipping industry on the East Coast, along with interests in construction, waste management, and a dozen other sectors that served as perfect covers for less legitimate activities. He had connections to politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials at every level. He had a reputation for fairness and ruthlessness in equal measure, a man who rewarded loyalty generously and punished betrayal without mercy. He was, by any measure, a success story that should have been impossible for a man who had been left to die in a warehouse with nothing but the clothes on his back. But what disturbed the Salvetti sisters most was not his power or his wealth. It was his complete indifference to their existence. In all the intelligence reports, in all the whispered gossip from informants and associates, there was not a single mention of the Salvetti family. Dante had not spoken about them, had not asked about them, had not made any move that could be interpreted as either hostility or interest. He had simply erased them from his life as completely as if they had never existed, as if the 15 years he had spent as their loyal protector meant nothing at all. This was not the revenge they had feared. This was something worse. This was the devastating realization that they had become irrelevant to a man they had once taken for granted, a man whose devotion they had assumed would last forever regardless of how they treated him. They had expected anger. They had prepared for violence. They had braced themselves for the inevitable confrontation with a man who had every reason to want them dead. Instead, they received silence, absence, the cold emptiness of a void where love had once been. Serena was the first to attempt contact. She had always been the boldest of the sisters, the one most willing to take risks in pursuit of what she wanted. She discovered that Daniel Morrow had a regular table at an exclusive restaurant in Manhattan, and she arranged to be there on an evening when her sources confirmed he would be dining alone. She wore her most stunning dress, styled her flame-red hair in the way that had brought countless men to their knees, and prepared herself to do whatever was necessary to break through his wall of indifference. But when she approached his table, when she stood before him with all her beauty and all her desperate hope, Dante simply looked up at her with the polite confusion of a stranger interrupted during his meal. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice pleasant and utterly devoid of recognition. "Is there something I can help you with?" "Dante," Serena breathed, abandoning all pretense of casual encounter. "Please, I know you remember me. I know you cannot have forgotten everything we shared." His expression did not change. There was no flicker of pain, no hint of suppressed emotion, nothing to suggest that her words had penetrated the armor he had constructed around himself. "I am afraid you have me confused with someone else," he said. "My name is Daniel, and I do not believe we have ever met." He returned his attention to his meal, dismissing her as completely as if she had been an overly persistent waitress. Serena stood there for a long moment, her face burning with humiliation and something deeper, something that felt terrifyingly like grief. Then she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the marble floor like the ticking of a clock, counting down to something inevitable. Lucia came next, though her approach was characteristically different from her sister's direct assault. She did not try to speak to Dante or force a confrontation. Instead, she simply appeared. She stood across the street from his office, a still figure in black, watching the building with her unsettling dark eyes. She appeared at events he attended, always at the edge of the crowd, always watching, never approaching. She followed his car through the streets of the city, making no attempt to hide her presence, as if she wanted him to know that she was there, that she was waiting, that she would continue to wait until he was ready to acknowledge her. But Dante never acknowledged her. He walked past her on the street as if she were invisible. He looked through her at parties as if she were made of glass. He gave no indication that her presence affected him in any way, and eventually, even Lucia's infinite patience began to crack. She stopped appearing, stopped following, stopped waiting for something that was never going to come. She retreated back to the chapel at the Salvetti estate and lit more candles, though now they seemed less like prayers and more like offerings to a god who had turned his back on his worshippers. Bianca made no attempt to contact Dante at all. She could not bear the thought of seeing that cold indifference directed at her, of hearing him speak to her as if they were strangers, of having the final confirmation that the love she had believed existed between them had been destroyed by her own weakness. Instead, she retreated further into herself, becoming a ghost in her own home, eating little, speaking less, spending hours alone in her room staring at walls that held no answers. The household noticed, of course. The servants whispered among themselves about the youngest Salvetti daughter and her mysterious decline. Marco Vellini, visiting his wife's family for one of his obligatory appearances, made cruel jokes about Bianca's mental state that Serena pretended not to hear. Don Enzo watched his youngest child fade away before his eyes and felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him with suffocating force. It was the Don himself who finally decided that something had to be done. He summoned Vittoria to his study on a cold evening in early December, when the first snow of the season was falling outside the windows, and the mansion felt more like a mausoleum than a home. He sat behind his desk, looking every one of his 74 years, a man who had once commanded respect from the most powerful figures in the city, but who now seemed diminished by burdens that had nothing to do with age or illness. "I want you to arrange a meeting," he said. "A proper meeting, with all the formalities. I want to speak to Dante myself." Vittoria hesitated. "Father," she said carefully, "he will not come. He has made it very clear that he wants nothing to do with us. Every attempt to reach him has been rejected. He does not even acknowledge that he knows who we are." "Then we must give him something he cannot refuse," Don Enzo replied. "We must offer him something of value, something that will force him to the table whether he wants to be there or not. What could we possibly offer him? He has money, power, influence. He has built everything himself, without our help, without anyone's help. What do we have that he would want?" The old man was silent for a long moment, staring at the portrait of his late wife that hung on the wall behind his desk. Then he said, "We have the truth. We have the answer to the question he has never asked, but has surely wondered about every day since that night. We have the reason why his family abandoned him." Vittoria felt a chill run down her spine. "Father," she whispered, "you cannot mean to tell him about that." "I mean to tell him everything," Don Enzo said. "I mean to give him the one thing that might matter to him more than revenge or indifference. I mean to give him understanding." The message was delivered through channels that could not be ignored. A formal invitation, written on the heavy cream-colored paper that the Salvetti family used for official correspondence, sealed with the family crest in blood-red wax. It was delivered to Dante's office by a messenger who waited for a response and was told to return the following day. When he did, he carried back a single word written in Dante's own hand: yes. The meeting was arranged for 3 days later, at the Salvetti mansion itself. Dante arrived precisely on time, driving himself in a black sedan that cost more than most houses in the neighborhood. He was dressed impeccably as always, his suit perfectly tailored, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, his scarred face composed into an expression of polite professional interest. He might have been arriving for any business meeting with any family about any matter of mutual concern. The four sisters watched from the windows of the upper floors as he walked up the path to the front door. Bianca's hands were shaking so badly that she had to clasp them together to keep them still. Serena's face was pale beneath her makeup. Lucia stood absolutely motionless, her dark eyes tracking Dante's every step with an intensity that was almost frightening. Only Vittoria seemed composed, but her composure was the thin ice over a deep lake, and everyone could sense the currents of emotion moving beneath. Dante was escorted to Don Enzo's study by a servant who had known him for 15 years, but who now looked at him as if he were a complete stranger. The room had not changed since the last time Dante had stood here, receiving orders from the man who had raised him. The same books lined the shelves. The same portraits stared down from the walls. The same mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, and behind it sat the same old man with silver hair and calculating eyes. But Don Enzo had changed. Age had finally caught up with him, stealing the vitality that had once made him seem invincible. His hands trembled slightly as they rested on the desk. His voice when he spoke was thinner than Dante remembered, roughened by the years and the weight of too many secrets. "Thank you for coming," the Don said. "Please, sit." Dante remained standing. "I prefer to stand," he said, "and I prefer to keep this brief. Your invitation mentioned a matter of importance. I'm listening." The old man nodded slowly, as if he had expected nothing else. "Very well," he said. "Then I will come directly to the point. I want to explain what happened that night, the night my daughters left you to die." Dante's face revealed nothing. "I have no interest in explanations," he said. "What happened, happened. It was 3 years ago. It no longer matters." "It matters to me," Don Enzo said. "And I believe it matters to you, whether you admit it or not. You have built walls around yourself, Dante. You have convinced yourself that you feel nothing, that you have moved beyond the pain of betrayal. But I have known you since you were a boy. I recognized the hunger in your eyes then, the desperate need to belong to something greater than yourself. That hunger does not simply disappear, it transforms. It becomes something else. And I believe it has become the engine that drives everything you have accomplished." Dante said nothing. He stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the old man's face, giving away nothing of what was happening behind his carefully constructed mask. "My daughters made a choice that night," Don Enzo continued. "A choice that I approved, though it broke something in me to do so. They chose to save Marco Vellini, because Marco was valuable to our alliance with the Vellini family. They chose to leave you because you were, in their calculation, expendable. A soldier, a tool, someone who could be replaced." "Tell me something I do not already know," Dante said, and for the first time there was an edge in his voice, a hint of the rage that he had buried so deep. Don Enzo leaned forward, his old eyes suddenly sharp and intense. "But that is not the whole truth," he said. "There is something else, something my daughters do not know, something I have never told anyone. The Ferrantis did not attack that meeting by chance. They knew exactly when and where we would be. They knew exactly who would be there, and they knew that Marco Vellini would be vulnerable." Dante's expression flickered just for an instant. "You are saying there was a traitor," he said. "I am saying there was a deal," Don Enzo replied. "A deal made by someone I trusted, someone who sold us out to the Ferrantis in exchange for promises that were never kept. The attack was planned. The choice my daughters had to make was manufactured. Someone wanted to see if they would sacrifice you to save Marco, and when they did, that someone got exactly what they wanted." "Who?" Dante asked, and now his voice was cold as the grave. "Who made this deal?" Don Enzo was silent for a long moment. Then he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a folder, yellowed with age but thick with documents. He slid it across the desk toward Dante. "Marco Vellini," the Don said. "He arranged the attack himself. He wanted to test my daughter's loyalty, to see if they would choose him over you. He wanted to eliminate you because he saw you as a threat, a man who had the love and trust of the women he intended to control. And when my daughters made their choice, he won. He won everything." Dante stared at the folder, but did not touch it. His face had gone very still, and something dangerous was moving behind his eyes. "My daughters do not know this," Don Enzo continued. "I discovered the truth only a year ago, long after Serena had married him, long after the alliance was sealed. I have kept it secret because revealing it would destroy the partnership between our families, would start a war that neither side could afford. But you deserve to know. You deserve to understand that my daughters were manipulated, that their choice was manufactured by a man who saw you as an obstacle to be removed." "Why are you telling me this now?" Dante asked. "What do you want from me?" The old man looked at him with eyes that held something Dante had never seen before, something that might have been genuine regret. "I want your forgiveness," Don Enzo said. "Not for myself, I am too old and have done too many terrible things to deserve forgiveness. But for my daughters. They have been carrying this guilt for 3 years, destroying themselves with it, and they do not even know that they were puppets in someone else's game. I want you to understand that they were weak, that they were wrong, but that they were also deceived. And I want you to consider, just consider, whether there might be room in that frozen heart of yours for something other than indifference." Dante picked up the folder and looked at it for a long moment. Then he turned and walked toward the door. "Where are you going?" Don Enzo called after him. Dante paused with his hand on the doorknob. "To consider," he said, "as you requested." And then he was gone, leaving the old man alone with his secrets and his regrets and the terrible knowledge that he had just set something in motion that he might not be able to control. The folder sat on Dante's desk for 3 days, unopened and accusing, a paper monument to everything he had tried to bury. He had read its contents once, on the night he returned from the Salvetti mansion, and then he had closed it and not touched it since. But he did not need to touch it. The words were burned into his memory now, each document a brand that seared his understanding of the past and forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew. Marco Vellini had orchestrated his death. Not the Ferrantes, not random chance, not the cruel mathematics of the underworld. Marco Vellini, the arrogant son of privilege who had called him a pet and laughed at his devotion, had deliberately arranged the attack that was meant to end his life. The documents in the folder made this unambiguous. Communications between Marco and Giovanni Ferrante, negotiated through intermediaries but unmistakably authentic. Financial records showing payments made before and after the warehouse ambush. Testimony from a Ferrante soldier who had been captured and interrogated by Don Enzo's men, confirming every detail of the conspiracy. Marco had wanted to test the Salvetti sisters. He had wanted to know if they would choose him over the loyal soldier who had protected them for 15 years. And when they did, when they left Dante to die without hesitation, Marco had gotten exactly what he wanted. Proof that they valued political alliance over personal loyalty. Proof that he could manipulate them. Proof that when he married into their family, he would be marrying women who could be controlled through fear and pragmatism rather than love. The irony was not lost on Dante. For 3 years, he had blamed the sisters for their betrayal. He had built his empire on the foundation of his rage toward them, using their abandonment as fuel for his transformation from loyal soldier to independent power. He had convinced himself that they were cold and calculating, that they had never truly cared about him, that their choice revealed the truth of who they really were. But the truth was more complicated. The sisters had been manipulated, pushed into an impossible situation by a man who had engineered their weakness. They were still responsible for their choice. They had still walked away. But they had not done it casually or callously. They had done it because Marco had created a scenario designed to force exactly that outcome. This did not change what had happened. Dante understood that clearly. The sisters could have chosen differently. They could have refused to leave him behind, could have found another way, could have at least attempted to save both men instead of abandoning one without hesitation. Their manipulation did not excuse their weakness, but it did add a layer of complexity that Dante had not anticipated, a shade of grey in a picture he had preferred to see in black and white. Salvatore found him on the 3rd night, sitting in the darkness of his study with the folder closed before him and a glass of whiskey untouched at his elbow. The old man entered without knocking, as he always did, and settled into the chair across from Dante with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had long since earned the right to intrude. "You have been brooding for 3 days," Salvatore observed. "That is not like you. You are a man of action, Dante. What has paralyzed you?" Dante did not answer immediately. He stared at the folder, at the plain manila surface that concealed so much ugliness, and tried to find words for what he was feeling. "I was wrong," he finally said. "Not about everything, not about the sisters and what they did, but about the shape of it, the meaning of it. I thought I understood what happened that night, but I only understood part of it. The rest was hidden from me, and now that I see it, I do not know what to do." Salvatore nodded slowly, his weathered face thoughtful in the dim light. "Tell me," he said. So Dante told him. He explained about Marco Vellini and the conspiracy, about the manufactured attack and the engineered choice, about the way the man who now shared Serena's bed had plotted to have him killed as casually as one might swat an inconvenient fly. He explained about Don Enzo's revelation and the old man's request for forgiveness on behalf of his daughters. And he explained about his own confusion, the way the new information had disrupted the certainties he had built his new life upon. When he finished, Salvatore was quiet for a long time. The old man seemed to be weighing something, considering his words with the care of someone who understood that what he said next might change everything. "Do you remember what I told you when we first began your training?" he asked. about the difference between revenge and justice. Dante nodded. You said revenge was personal, emotional. It satisfied the heart but accomplished nothing lasting. Justice was different. Justice was about correcting a wrong in a way that created something better. And what would justice look like here? Salvatore asked. Not revenge, not the satisfaction of seeing Marco Bellini suffer, but actual justice. What would that require? Dante thought about this. The answer came slowly, emerging from somewhere deep inside him that he had not visited in a very long time. It would require accountability, he said. For Marco, certainly. He planned the attack. He nearly killed me. He has spent 3 years enjoying the fruits of his conspiracy while I rebuilt myself from nothing. He should face consequences for what he did. And the sisters? Dante hesitated. The sisters, he repeated slowly. They were manipulated, but they still made their choice. They still walked away. Yes, Salvatore agreed. They did. But manipulation matters, Dante. Context matters. You have spent 3 years judging them based on incomplete information. Now you have the complete picture. The question is whether that changes anything. Does it? Dante asked. Should it? Salvatore smiled, a sad and knowing expression that held decades of wisdom earned through pain. That is not for me to decide, he said, but I will tell you this. You have become a powerful man. You have built something impressive from nothing but pain and determination. But power without purpose is empty, and I have watched you long enough to know that your purpose has always been about more than money or influence. You wanted to prove that you mattered, that your loyalty was worth something, that the people who abandoned you made a mistake. Well, you have proven all of those things. The question now is what you do with that proof. Dante stared at the folder for a long moment. Then he reached out and pushed it aside, as if clearing space for something new. I think, he said slowly, that I need to have some conversations. The first conversation was with Serena. He found her at the restaurant where she had confronted him months before, sitting alone at a table near the window, nursing a drink that was clearly not her first. She looked up when he approached, and for a moment her face showed the same guarded hope it had shown before. Then she seemed to remember how that encounter had ended, and the hope faded into something closer to resignation. "May I sit?" Dante asked. Serena gestured to the empty chair across from her. "It is a free country," she said, "though I was under the impression you did not know who I was." Dante sat down. He looked at her for a long moment, at the red hair that still fell like flames, at the beautiful face that had aged with bitterness and regret, at the woman who had once been fire and ambition, and was now trapped in a marriage to the man who had tried to have him killed. "I know who you are," he said. "I have always known. I just was not ready to acknowledge it." Something flickered in Serena's eyes. Hope, perhaps, or fear, or some complicated mixture of both. "And now you are ready?" she asked. "I am ready to tell you something," Dante replied. "Something you need to hear. Not for my sake, but for yours." He told her about Marco. He told her about the conspiracy, the manufactured attack, the deliberate engineering of a situation designed to test her loyalty and eliminate a rival. He told her about the documents in the folder, the proof that her husband had orchestrated everything, that her choice to save him had been manipulated from the beginning. Serena listened without interrupting. Her face went through a journey of emotions, from disbelief to horror, to a rage so intense that it seemed to burn away everything else. By the time Dante finished speaking, her hands were shaking so badly that the ice in her drink was rattling against the glass. "That bastard," she whispered. "That manipulative, scheming bastard. I gave up everything for him. I walked away from a man who loved me, who would have died for me, because I thought Marco was the safer choice, and the whole time he was playing me like a puppet." "You did not know," Dante said. "None of you knew. Marco was clever, and he had help from people who knew how to hide their tracks. John Enzo only discovered the truth a year ago, and he kept it secret because revealing it would have destroyed the alliance." Serena laughed, a bitter sound that held no humor. "The alliance," she repeated. "Always the alliance. Always the business. That is all any of us ever were, is it not? Pieces on a chessboard, moved around for strategic advantage. Father's daughters, sold to the highest bidder, and you were the loyal knight who got sacrificed so the queen could escape. She looked at him then, really looked at him, seeing not the stranger who had pretended not to know her, but the man who had once saved her life, who had stood guard outside her door on countless nights, who had loved her family with a devotion that none of them had ever deserved. "I am sorry," she said, and her voice cracked on the words. "I am so sorry, Dante. I know that does not fix anything. I know that sorry does not give you back the 3 years you lost, or heal the scars, or undo what we did to you. But I need you to know that I am sorry. I have been sorry every day since that night, even before I knew about Marco. I never stopped thinking about you. I never stopped wondering if you were alive, if you were suffering, if you hated us as much as we deserved to be hated." Dante was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I did hate you. For a long time I hated all of you with everything I had. That hate was what kept me alive, what drove me to become what I am. But hate is exhausting, Serena. And somewhere along the way, I realized that holding on to it was only hurting me. You had moved on with your lives. You were not lying awake at night, tormented by my anger. The only person suffering from my hatred was me." "So you stopped hating us?" Serena asked. "I stopped letting the hate control me," Dante replied. "That is not the same thing, but it is a start." Serena reached across the table and took his hand. The gesture was tentative, questioning, as if she expected him to pull away at any moment. When he did not, she held on tighter, her fingers intertwining with his. "What happens now?" she asked. Dante looked at their joined hands, at the physical connection he had once craved more than anything in the world. "Now," he said, "we deal with Marco, and then we see what comes next." The confrontation with Marco Vellini took place 2 weeks later, at a meeting that Dante had arranged through channels that Marco could not refuse. The Vellini family had been experiencing difficulties lately, complications with their shipping operations that seemed to arise from nowhere and vanish just as mysteriously. These complications were costing them money and reputation, and Marco had been tasked with finding the source and eliminating it. The source, of course, was Dante. He had been quietly undermining Marco's business for months, using his connections and resources to create problems that only he could solve. It was a classic strategy, creating a dependency that would force his target to come to him on terms of his choosing. And now Marco was coming, desperate for a solution, completely unaware that he was walking into a trap of his own making. They met in a warehouse that Dante controlled, a deliberate echo of the location where Marco had tried to have him killed 3 years before. The symbolism was not subtle, but subtlety had never been Dante's strength. He preferred directness, clarity, the clean lines of cause and effect. Marco arrived with 2 bodyguards, which was expected. Dante's men disarmed them at the door, which was also expected. What was not expected was the presence of 4 women waiting in the shadows of the warehouse floor, their faces illuminated by the harsh industrial lighting, their eyes fixed on Marco with expressions that ranged from cold fury to devastated betrayal. Vittoria, Serena, Lucia, Bianca. The 4 Salvetti sisters gathered together for the first time since the night they had left Dante to die, united now by a common purpose and a shared enemy. Marco stopped dead when he saw them. His handsome face went pale, and for the first time since Dante had known him, the mask of arrogance slipped to reveal the frightened boy underneath. "What is this?" Marco demanded, his voice pitched higher than usual. "What the hell is going on?" Dante stepped out of the shadows, positioning himself between Marco and the door. "This is a reckoning," he said. "Did you really think you could orchestrate my murder and never face consequences? Did you really believe you were clever enough to keep your secret forever?" "I do not know what you are talking about," Marco said. But his eyes were darting between the exits, calculating escape routes that no longer existed. "You are insane. I barely knew you. I had nothing to do with what happened at that warehouse." "Liar!" Serena spat. She stepped forward, her red hair blazing under the lights, her face twisted with a rage that had been building for months. "We know everything, Marco. We know about your deal with the Ferrantes. We know you paid them to attack us. We know you wanted to see if we would choose you over Dante, and when we did, You used that choice to control us for 3 years. Marco's composure crumbled completely. He looked at the four sisters, at the united front they presented, and he seemed to realize for the first time that he was truly trapped. It was not personal, he said, and the desperation in his voice was almost pitiful. It was business. Dante was a threat. He had too much influence with all of you. I needed to remove him so that our alliance could proceed without interference. A threat, Dante repeated. His voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was something dangerous moving behind his eyes. I was a soldier who had spent 15 years protecting the women you wanted to marry. I had no ambitions beyond service. I wanted nothing except to belong. And you decided I was a threat. You were in love with them, Marco said. All of them. Any fool could see it. And they cared about you too in their way. How was I supposed to build a marriage with that kind of competition? How was I supposed to be sure that Serena would choose me when I needed her to? So you arranged for me to die, Dante said. You turned the Ferrantis into your assassins and the Salvetti sisters into your accomplices. You made them complicit in their own manipulation, and you never felt a moment of guilt. Marco said nothing. There was nothing he could say. The evidence was overwhelming, and the witnesses were arrayed against him in a wall of righteous fury. Vittoria spoke for the first time, her voice cold as winter. Our father knows about your treachery, she said. As of this morning, the alliance between our families is dissolved. Your father has been informed that you are no longer welcome in Salvetti territory. If you set foot in Brooklyn again, you will be treated as an enemy. My father will never believe this, Marco said, but his voice lacked conviction. He will never take your word over mine. He does not have to take our word, Lucia said, stepping forward with a folder in her hands. The same folder that Don Enzo had given to Dante, now copied and distributed to everyone who needed to see it. He has documents, communications, financial records, testimony from people who were involved in your conspiracy. Your father is a businessman, Marco. He knows how to read evidence, and when he reads this, he will know that you are a liability he cannot afford. Marco's face contorted with fear and rage. You cannot do this, he snarled. I am Marco Vellini. My family is one of the most powerful in the city. You think you can just destroy me because of some misunderstanding 3 years ago? It was not a misunderstanding, Bianca said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the warehouse like a knife. She stepped forward, her soft features hardened by months of grief and guilt, her eyes fixed on Marco with an intensity that none of her sisters had ever seen. You tried to kill someone I loved. You manipulated my sisters into abandoning him. You turned us into monsters so that you could feel powerful, and now you're going to pay for it. Marco looked at her, at the youngest and supposedly weakest of the Salvetti sisters, and something in his expression shifted. You, he said, you were always the sentimental one, always crying over things that did not matter. Is that what this is about? Your pathetic feelings for the family pet? Bianca did not respond with words. She simply walked forward, closed the distance between them, and slapped Marco across the face with enough force to turn his head. His name is Dante, she said, and he was never a pet. He was the only one of us who ever understood what loyalty truly meant. Marco stumbled backward, his hand pressed to his reddening cheek, his eyes wide with shock. No one had ever struck him before. No one had ever dared. Dante stepped forward, positioning himself directly in front of Marco. Here is what is going to happen, he said. You are going to leave New York. Tonight. You are going to disappear somewhere far away, somewhere you cannot cause any more damage, and you are never going to contact the Salvetti family again. And if I refuse, Marco asked, trying to summon some of his former arrogance. Dante smiled, a cold expression that held no warmth or mercy. Then I will do to you what you tried to do to me, he said. Except I will not leave it to chance. I will make sure you do not survive. Marco looked at the faces arrayed against him, the four sisters who had once been his path to power, the man he had tried to murder risen from the dead, the soldiers who stood in every shadow with hands resting on weapons. He looked at all of them, and he understood at last that he had lost. Fine, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I will leave. Yes, Dante agreed. You will. Marco was escorted out by Dante's men, put on a plane that same night, and sent to a remote location in South America, where he would spend the rest of his life far from the corridors of power he had once hoped to walk. The Vellini family, presented with the evidence of their son's treachery, chose pragmatism over sentiment and allowed the exile without protest. Marco Vellini would live, but he would live as a ghost, stripped of everything that had made him believe he was special. It was not death, it was not the blood vengeance that the old ways would have demanded, but it was justice, in its way, and Dante found that it was enough. After Marco was gone, after the warehouse had emptied and the drama had concluded, Dante found himself standing alone with Bianca in the cold December night. The other sisters had departed with promises to talk more, to rebuild what had been broken, to find some way forward together, but Bianca had stayed behind, lingering in the shadows, as if waiting for something she was afraid to ask for. They stood in silence for a long moment, two people who had once been so close and were now separated by years of pain and misunderstanding. "You did not have to do any of this," Bianca finally said. "You could have walked away. You could have let Marco continue his life and never looked back. Why did you help us?" Dante considered the question. The truthful answer was complicated, a tangle of motivations he was only beginning to understand. But when he spoke, he chose the simplest version, the one that mattered most. "Because you deserved to know the truth," he said. "And because somewhere underneath all the anger and the pain, I still cared about what happened to you." Bianca's eyes filled with tears, the same tears she had shed on the night she walked away from him in that corridor. "I have dreamed about you every night for 3 years," she whispered. "I have replayed that moment over and over, wishing I had been brave enough to stay, wishing I had chosen differently, wishing I had been worthy of your love." Dante looked at her, at the woman who had once represented everything he hoped for and lost. The anger he had carried for so long was still there, but it was smaller now, a coal instead of a conflagration, and beside it, something else was beginning to grow, something he was not yet ready to name. "We cannot go back," he said. "We cannot undo what happened or pretend that the past 3 years did not exist, but maybe we can go forward. Maybe we can find out if there is something left worth saving." Bianca reached out and took his hand, just as Serena had done in the restaurant, but this time the gesture felt different. This time it felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. "I would like that," she said. "I would like that very much." Dante looked at their joined hands, at the physical connection that bridged the gap between who they had been and who they might become. He did not smile because smiling did not come easily to him anymore, but something in his chest loosened, some knot that had been pulled tight for 3 years, finally beginning to unravel. "Then let us begin," he said, "one step at a time." Spring came to New York like a hesitant lover, testing the waters before committing to warmth. The snow melted slowly from the streets of Brooklyn, revealing the grime and the beauty that lay beneath, the eternal cycle of death and rebirth that defined this city of shadows and dreams. In the Salvetti mansion, windows that had been shuttered against the cold were thrown open to admit the pale March sunlight, and for the first time in years, the house felt less like a mausoleum and more like a home. Dante stood at one of those windows, looking out at the garden where he had once stood guard on countless occasions, watching the sisters he loved from a distance he had never been permitted to close. The garden was overgrown now, neglected during the dark years when the household had been consumed by guilt and silence. But someone had begun clearing it recently, pulling weeds and planting new flowers, and Dante suspected he knew who. 3 months had passed since Marco's exile, 3 months of careful conversations and tentative gestures, of rebuilding bridges that had been burned and discovering that some things could not be rebuilt at all. The road forward was neither straight nor smooth, but it was a road, and that was more than Dante had ever expected to find. His relationship with each of the sisters had evolved in different ways, shaped by their individual personalities and the unique history he shared with each of them. Vittoria remained the most difficult. She had spent so long being the pragmatic one, the calculating strategist who made hard choices without flinching, that admitting her mistake felt like admitting that her entire worldview was flawed. She could not simply say she was sorry and move on. She had to understand, to analyze, to dissect every moment of that night, and determine exactly where her reasoning had failed. Her conversations with Dante were more like negotiations than reconciliations, each of them careful to maintain their dignity while slowly acknowledging truths that had been buried for too long. But progress was being made. Vittoria had invited Dante to a family dinner 2 weeks ago, the first time he had sat at the Salvetti table since his resurrection. She had placed him at her right hand, the position of honor, and though neither of them had commented on the symbolism, everyone in the room had understood what it meant. Vittoria was not a woman who expressed emotion through words. She expressed it through actions, through the language of power and position that she had spent her life mastering. And by placing Dante at her side, she was telling the world that he mattered to her, that he had always mattered, that she regretted ever allowing anyone to believe otherwise. Serena had been the most vocal in her remorse, which was consistent with her nature. She had divorced Marco within weeks of his exile, using the evidence of his conspiracy as grounds for annulment, and she had thrown herself into repairing her relationship with Dante with the same intensity she brought to everything else. She called him daily, sometimes multiple times, wanting to share meals, to talk about nothing, to simply be in his presence, as if proximity could erase the distance that had grown between them. Dante appreciated her efforts, even when they overwhelmed him. Serena's fire had returned, brighter than ever now that she was free from the prison of her manipulated marriage. She spoke of plans for the future, of ways they could work together, of the empire they could build if they combined their resources and talents. She did not ask for forgiveness directly, because that was not Serena's way. She simply acted as if forgiveness had already been granted, as if the past was merely an obstacle to be overcome, rather than a wound that needed time to heal. Sometimes this presumption irritated Dante, but more often he found himself grateful for it. Serena's refusal to dwell on guilt and regret forced him to look forward instead of backward, to focus on what could be rather than what had been. She was not apologizing for the past. She was creating a future in which the past would eventually become irrelevant. Lucia remained the most mysterious, as she had always been. She did not seek out Dante's company or avoid it. She simply existed in his orbit, appearing when he least expected her, watching him with those dark eyes that seemed to see through every mask he wore. She rarely spoke, but when she did, her words carried weight that lighter conversation could never match. One evening, she had appeared beside him as he stood on the balcony of a restaurant where he was hosting business associates. She had materialized from nowhere, as was her habit, and stood silently beside him for several minutes before speaking. "I always knew you would survive," she said, "even when they told me you were dead. I knew." Dante had looked at her, at the pale face that revealed nothing and the eyes that revealed everything. "How?" he asked. "Because you were the only one of us who deserved to," she replied, "and the universe is not always unjust." Then she had vanished back into the crowd, leaving Dante to wonder, as he always wondered with Lucia, what she truly meant and what she truly felt. But somehow, her words had meant more than any apology or explanation could have. Lucia saw the world differently than anyone else, and if she believed that his survival was a form of cosmic justice, then perhaps it was true. And then there was Bianca. Bianca was the reason Dante stood at this window now, waiting for her to emerge from the mansion and join him in the garden. Their relationship had progressed more slowly than the others, not because the connection between them was weaker, but because it was stronger. What they were building required more care, more patience, more willingness to be vulnerable in ways that did not come naturally to either of them anymore. They had been meeting regularly for the past 2 months, sometimes for meals, sometimes for walks through the city, sometimes simply to sit together in comfortable silence. They did not talk about the past often. They did not need to. The past was always present between them, a shadow that colored every interaction, but it was a shadow they were learning to walk through rather than around. Dante had discovered that Bianca was not the same woman she had been 3 years ago. The gentle girl who had brought him coffee and remembered his birthday had been replaced by someone more complex, someone who had been forged by grief and guilt into a form that was both harder and more beautiful. She still had her kindness, her capacity for compassion, her desire to see good in the world and in the people around her, but she had also developed an inner strength that had not been there before, a resilience that had been born from surviving her own personal hell. She had told him about the 3 years he had been gone, about the nights she had spent crying for a man she believed was dead, about the prayers she had whispered for a soul she feared she had damned. She had told him about refusing marriage proposals, about withdrawing from her family, about the creeping despair that had threatened to consume her entirely. She had told him everything, holding nothing back, offering her pain as a gift that he could accept or reject as he chose. Dante had accepted it, not because he wanted to see her suffer, but because he understood that sharing her pain was the only way she knew how to show him that it was real. She needed him to know that his absence had mattered, that his supposed death had left a wound that 3 years had failed to heal. And she needed him to know that his return, his survival, his presence in her life once again, was the answer to prayers she had never stopped whispering. The door to the garden opened, and Bianca emerged into the spring sunlight. She wore a simple white dress that caught the breeze, and her hair was loose around her shoulders, the way she had worn it when she was younger, before the weight of guilt had pressed her into something smaller and darker. She smiled when she saw him, a genuine smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face, and Dante felt something stir in his chest that he had thought was dead forever. "You are early," she said, crossing the garden to stand beside him. "I was not expecting you for another hour." "I had nothing else to do," Dante replied, "and I wanted to see the garden. Someone has been working hard on it." Bianca blushed slightly, looking away. "It was getting out of control," she said. "I thought it could use some attention." "It looks good," Dante said. "It looks like it is coming back to life." Bianca turned to face him, and her expression became serious. "Like us," she said quietly. "Coming back to life, I mean. Sometimes I still cannot believe this is real, that you are here, that you are willing to even speak to us after everything that happened. I keep waiting to wake up and discover it was all a dream." Dante reached out and took her hand, the gesture becoming more natural with each passing day. "It is real," he said. "I am here, and I am not going anywhere." They walked through the garden together, past the newly planted flowers and the old trees that had witnessed so much over the years. They did not speak for a long time, content simply to be in each other's presence, to feel the warmth of their joined hands and the promise of spring in the air around them. Eventually, Bianca broke the silence. "Father wants to see you," she said. "He has been asking for you for the past week, but he did not want to summon you like a subordinate. He wanted me to invite you as a friend, as family." "How is he?" Dante asked. Bianca's expression darkened. "Not well," she admitted. "The doctors say it could be weeks or it could be months, but either way the end is coming. He has accepted it. I think in some ways he has been waiting for it ever since that night." Dante nodded slowly. He had heard about Don Enzo's declining health, had seen the signs himself during their last meeting. But hearing it confirmed still struck him with unexpected force. The Don had been many things to him: savior and manipulator, father figure and betrayer, the man who had given him everything and then allowed his daughters to take it all away. Their relationship was too complicated to be reduced to simple categories of love or hate, gratitude or resentment. It simply was, a tangle of emotions that Dante had stopped trying to unravel. "I will go to him," Dante said. "Today, if he is willing to receive me." Bianca squeezed his hand. "He will be willing," she said. "He has been waiting for this conversation for a long time." Don Enzo's bedroom was on the 2nd floor of the mansion, in the same suite where he had slept for over 40 years, where he had shared a bed with his beloved wife before cancer had claimed her, where he had made decisions that shaped the fate of families and fortunes. The room was darker now, the curtains drawn against the spring sunlight, as if the old man was already preparing himself for the eternal darkness that awaited. Dante entered alone, closing the door behind him and crossing to the chair that had been placed beside the bed. Don Enzo lay propped against a mountain of pillows, his silver hair thin and wispy now, his face hollowed by illness, his hands resting on the covers like fallen leaves waiting for the wind to scatter them. But his eyes were still sharp, still calculating, still the eyes of a man who had spent his life reading people and situations with uncanny accuracy. "You came," the Don said, his voice a thin rasp that was nothing like the commanding tone Dante remembered. "I was not sure you would." "Bianca asked me," Dante replied. "As a friend, as family. I could not refuse." The old man smiled, a ghost of the expression that had once commanded respect and fear in equal measure. "Family," he repeated. "That word has caused us both so much pain. And yet, here we are, still using it, still reaching for it, still hoping it might mean something in the end." Dante said nothing. He waited, as he had learned to wait during his years of transformation, for the other person to reveal what they truly wanted. "I am dying," Don Enzo said. "The doctors give me weeks, maybe less. There is no point in pretending otherwise. And before I go, there are things I need to say to you, things I should have said 3 years ago, or 15 years ago, or the day I first took you into my home." He paused, gathering strength for what came next. Dante could see the effort it cost him, the way his body struggled against the weakness that was consuming it. "I took you from that alley because I saw something in you," the Don continued. "A hunger, a loyalty, a capacity for devotion that I knew I could use. I told myself I was doing you a favor, giving you a home and a purpose, but the truth is, I was using you from the very beginning. I raised you to be a tool, Dante, a weapon that could be pointed at my enemies, and I made sure you never forgot that you were not truly one of us, that your place in this family was contingent on your usefulness." "I knew that," Dante said. "I always knew that." "Yes," Don Enzo agreed. "You did. And yet you stayed. You served. You loved my daughters with a purity that I have never seen in anyone else. That was when I realized I had made a terrible mistake. I had created something I did not understand. I had taken a hungry boy and given him something to believe in, and he had believed so completely that nothing could shake his faith. Until that night." Dante felt the old anger stirring in his chest, but he kept it contained. "That night was a long time ago," he said. "I have moved past it." "No," Don Enzo said, shaking his head weakly. "You have not. You have built walls around it, buried it under success and power and the pretense of indifference, but you have not moved past it. I can see it in your eyes, Dante. The boy I took from that alley is still in there, still wondering why the people he loved threw him away." Dante opened his mouth to deny it, but the words would not come, because the old man was right. He was still that boy underneath everything. He was still hungry for the belonging that had been promised and never delivered. "I cannot undo what happened," Don Enzo said. "I cannot bring back the 3 years you lost, or heal the scars that we put on your body and your soul. But I can give you something. Something that I should have given you long ago." He reached beneath his pillow and withdrew a document, yellowed with age but clearly important, bearing seals and signatures that Dante did not immediately recognize. "This is my will," the Don said. "I have amended it. When I die, everything I own will be divided among my 4 daughters, as it was always meant to be. But there is a new provision. A provision that names you as a full member of this family, with all the rights and privileges that entails. You will not be a servant or a soldier or a tool anymore, Dante. You will be a son. My son, in every legal and binding sense of the word." Dante stared at the document, unable to process what he was hearing. "You cannot do this," he said. "Your daughters will never accept it." "My daughters have already accepted it," Don Enzo replied. "I spoke to each of them before making this decision. They agreed unanimously. Vittoria proposed it, actually. She said it was the least we could do to make amends for what was taken from you." Dante felt something cracking inside him, some wall he had built so carefully over the years beginning to crumble. "This changes nothing," he said, but his voice was unsteady. "This does not erase what happened." "No," the old man agreed, "it does not. Nothing can erase that. But it is a beginning, a foundation on which something new can be built. You have already forgiven my daughters, Dante. I can see it in the way you look at Bianca, in the way you have allowed them back into your life. All I am asking is that you consider forgiving an old man who made terrible mistakes and wants to die knowing that he tried at the end to make them right." Dante looked at the document in his hands, at the signatures and seals that made it legally binding, at the words that transformed him from an outsider to an heir. He thought about the boy in the alley, the one who had taken a stranger's hand because he was desperate for something to believe in. He thought about the soldier who had given everything and received nothing in return. He thought about the man who had risen from the ashes of betrayal to build something that belonged only to him. And he thought about what it would mean to belong again, not as a servant or a tool, but as family. Real family. "I will consider it," he said finally. "That is all I can promise." Don Enzo smiled, and there was peace in his expression that had not been there before. "That is enough," he said. "That is more than enough." Don Enzo Salvetti died 3 weeks later, on a warm April morning when the garden was in full bloom, and the sun was shining through the windows of his bedroom. His 4 daughters were with him at the end, along with the man who had once been their protector and was now their brother in every way that mattered. The old Don passed peacefully, his last breath a sigh of release after decades of carrying burdens that no one else could understand. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, the powerful and the desperate, the loyal and the treacherous, all gathered to pay their respects to a man who had shaped the underworld of New York for half a century. Dante stood with the Salvetti sisters at the front of the church, wearing the black suit of a mourner and the expression of a man who had lost something complicated and irreplaceable. Afterwards, there was a reception at the mansion, and then the reading of the will, and then the long process of dividing and distributing the empire that Don Enzo had built. Vittoria took control of the organization, with the same cold efficiency she had always displayed. But now there was a new warmth beneath the ice, a recognition that power meant nothing without the people you shared it with. Serena threw herself into legitimate businesses, channeling her fire into enterprises that would secure the family's future for generations. Lucia continued to watch and wait, her dark eyes seeing things that others missed, her silence speaking volumes to those who knew how to listen. And Bianca remained at Dante's side, their relationship deepening with each passing day, transforming from tentative reconciliation into something stronger and more enduring. They did not rush. They did not need to. They had wasted 3 years to pain and separation, and they were determined not to waste any more. A year after Don Enzo's death, on a spring evening that echoed the one when Dante had first returned to the Salvetti mansion, he and Bianca walked together through the garden that she had restored to beauty. The sun was setting over Brooklyn, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and the flowers she had planted were blooming in riots of color that would have amazed anyone who had seen the overgrown wilderness it had once been. "Do you remember what you said to me the first night we talked?" Bianca asked, her hand warm in his, about not being able to go back but maybe being able to go forward. Dante nodded. "I remember." "Do you think we have gone forward?" she asked. "Do you think we have found what we were looking for?" Dante considered the question. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, from the alley where Don Enzo had found him to the warehouse where he had been left to die, to the empire he had built, from the ashes of his betrayal. He thought about the walls he had constructed and the ones he had torn down, the anger he had carried and the forgiveness he had learned to give. He thought about the family he had lost and the family he had found, not through blood but through the harder and more meaningful process of choosing to belong. "I think," he said slowly, "that going forward is not a destination, it is a direction. We do not arrive somewhere and stop. We keep moving, keep growing, keep becoming something new. And as long as we are moving together, as long as we are facing whatever comes side by side, then I think we have found something worth having." Bianca leaned her head against his shoulder, and he felt the rightness of her presence, the warmth of connection that he had once believed was lost to him forever. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you since I was 17 years old, even when I did not understand what love meant, even when I was too afraid to fight for it. I love you, Dante, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you know it." Dante turned to face her, taking both her hands in his, looking into the eyes that had once wept for him in a dark corridor and now shone with a light that had nothing to do with the sunset. "I love you too," he said, "and that is not something I say lightly. For a long time I did not think I was capable of love anymore. I thought that part of me had died in that warehouse, along with the boy who believed that loyalty would be rewarded. But you brought it back. You and your sisters, even Vittoria and Serena and Lucia, even your father at the end. You showed me that love is not about deserving. It is about choosing, and I choose you. I choose all of you. I choose this family that hurt me and healed me and made me into someone I never thought I could be." Bianca kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Dante felt the last of his walls crumble into dust. He was home. Not because he stood on Salvetti ground or wore the Salvetti name, but because he had finally found the belonging he had spent his entire life searching for. The 4 Salvetti sisters had saved the rival over him. They had left him to die in a warehouse, abandoned and alone because they thought he was expendable. They had been wrong. They had been manipulated. They had been weak in a moment when weakness cost them everything. But weakness was not the end of the story, it was the beginning. And from that beginning, from that dark night of betrayal and blood, something new had grown. Something stronger. Something that could not be destroyed by the schemes of ambitious men or the cold calculations of power. Dante Marrone had been reborn from the ashes of his own death. He had cut ties with the family that had betrayed him. He had watched them cry and beg and try to explain. And in the end, he had chosen to love them anyway. Not because they deserved it, not because they had earned it, but because love was the only thing that had ever made his life worth living. And he was done letting fear take it away from him. The sisters had cried when he cut ties, but they cried harder when he chose to return, when he opened his heart and let them back in, when he proved that the loyalty they had once taken for granted was stronger than any betrayal they could inflict. That was the true revenge. Not destruction or indifference, but forgiveness. The knowledge that he had become something greater than their worst expectations, and that he had chosen to share that greatness with them, despite everything they had done. Dante Marrone walked through the garden of the Salvetti mansion, with Bianca's hand in his, and he felt the warmth of the setting sun on his face, and he knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The shadows of the past would always be there, lurking at the edges of his happiness, reminding him of the price he had paid to reach this moment. But shadows needed light to exist, and there was more light in his life now than he had ever dared to hope for. He was home, he was family, and he was finally, after all these years, at peace.